Thank you, Chris.
No, an absolute pleasure. And no, I've actually found this an incredible 48 hours or however long it's been. And actually, you sold this to me. And it's actually funny because I came here thinking religion and film, talk about my students. I saw my students on Tuesday for this very module, and I got them to answer the question, on which is the topic of the paper. So it's very fresh and up to date. But actually listening to all the other papers, because I do work on death and the afterlife, and the paper yesterday completely was in there. I'm doing some stuff at the moment on the death of the Queen in the context of nostalgia, so the paper yesterday that Ian gave completely fits in. So there are so many sort of areas, and I was thinking in a funny way, the paper I'm going to give here probably in some ways has a little less to do than some of the many other strands. So it just shows. So if you have me back next year, there are plenty of other. Absolutely. But what I wanted to do, because this is really important to me, because I've been teaching at the institution where I am. So I'm at the University of Kent for 19 years. Now, I used to be so daunted by seminars. In fact, I almost used to sort of try and avoid doing a proper seminar because I'd always be sort of trying to present material. And sometimes if you've got an hour slot or 2 hour and you sort of run out of time, it's very tempting to say, oh, well, we'll continue the conversation or I'll continue delivering this material in the seminar. So the seminar was almost the sort of space where, sure, if students have got presentations to give, then they do those. But then I would fill the gaps. Now, I didn't intend to say that, but that's exactly what I would do. And I'm conscious that I do this anyway in conversations. I'm probably... so I think people often like being interviewed by me, because if they suddenly run out of things to say, I fill in the gap. And so when I'm teaching my students, they kind of know I don't like silence. Now, I always give them a chance to answer, but I don't sort of then start pointing and saying, okay, who's going to answer the question? So, but I find another way of addressing the problem. So whatever the challenge is, whatever the question, I've got a whole series of slides here to go through this. What I'll do is represent the material, represent the question, get them to work in small groups or whatever it might be. So, I've been delivering the module on religion and film for a while. Now, what I do in the first lecture, and this is some of the stuff I'm going to start by talking about, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the sort of stuff I deliver, then how I unpack that, and crucially, the questions that I use in my seminars are reframed questions from what in previous years students have divulged in a seminar. In other words, I always write down what the students tell me. So I sit there, and admittedly there are better forms of technology than what I use, because I use an old, I simply use a Word document. And I write it down, and I share it with them afterwards. But you can use, is it like Padlock, I think now? And I'm so analog in my thinking. But I write it all down, and they watch me write it all down on the screen. Then I send it to them afterwards, and I always invite the students to send me stuff as well, so that can be added to. So it's a repository of work. But it's using work from previous years that students have delivered. So it's the students who are framing the questions for the seminar. So I try to make a distinction there from me simply saying, okay, I'll just continue lecturing to you. So when I was an undergraduate 30 odd years ago, we had very few seminars. So when I started teaching, I knew what a lecture was. I don't think I knew what a seminar was. So this is something that I've sort of been learning over the course of the last few decades. So I will always begin by asking that question, not just to the students, why are you taking this module? I explain my motivations for teaching it. So I give a bit of a background there. And one thing I've learned, and the students are a phenomenal bunch in many cases, is that, of course, they're interested in film to a point, but not to an obsessive degree. And they don't go to the cinema. I go obsessively. I go as often as I can, which means every night. But yeah, some other story. But that's my fandom. But the students, in some ways, will watch things on their phones. They will watch lots of sort of TV series. They watch Netflix and so on. So I'm and also one of the seminar discussion points, one of the topics of one of the lectures, as I'll show you in a minute, is on cinema going as religious practice. So in many cases, they don't engage with film at the cinema. So that changes the way that I apprehend the material. So there's a whole thesis that Clive Marsh has put forward, which I'll come to in a minute, but that doesn't work anymore with students for whom going to the cinema is not the same way as engaging with the film. They do it in other ways, if they do it at all. And often the charge will be, oh, I very rarely go to the cinema, maybe once a year, etc. And they don't watch biblical epics. So you can imagine. There's a colleague, Adele Reinhardt, who's based in Canada, and she does, if she was doing a module on religion and film, as she does, it's entirely based around Virgin Mary, Judas, Simon Magus, Jesus, Joseph, all the sort of, Pontius Pilate, and the way that they're all represented in the different Jesus films. It's a perfectly great course, but it's not the way I deal with my material. The students, I think, who never watch biblical epics anyway, would find that sort of course, I think, a bit grueling. So I explain my motivation for delivering it. And one of the things that we're trying to do as well is say, well, it's a category question. What is religion? In order to talk about the relationship between religion and film, you kind of have to know what religion is. So there's lots of potentially boring, but definitional, methodological material. So we cover a lot of that. What is religion? We did the same with film. And what sort of films are we talking about? I mean, we had that interesting conversation earlier about whether film might be ultimately, the tool of the devil. Well, I mean, we're talking about genre films. What about escapist films? What about film noir, which came up in the conversation earlier? We're talking about gangster films. We're talking about a whole sort of range of genres. Are they the same? There's nothing monolithic going on here. And we look at a thesis that John Lydon has put forward about whether film could even be a religion in terms of the practices, not just the themes of the film, but the way people engage with them, the rituals of the film, the transformative possibilities of the film. So these are all the sort of things that we deal with here. What sort of a relationship, what sort of dialogue is there? Or are they in very sort of discrete, separate spheres? And also we have to be careful with the whole reductionistic question as well, about making sure that we're not simply saying this is what a film is, this is what religion is, the two sort of go together by some form of osmosis. So we're aware that the danger of reductionism, in the same way that you might reduce to religion to anthropology or psychology, and the risk here is that you're kind of saying that all films are the same and religion is the same. That's why I have a problem with a lot of the stuff on Christ figure motifs, because there's the assumption that there's this ideal Neoplatonic construct, which is called, Jesus, and all these films bear witness to different facets of his personality. Biblical scholars don't agree on who Jesus was. Filmmakers don't agree on who Jesus was. You look at Scorsese's Last Temptation with the very neurotic, schizophrenic, tortured Jesus. Compare that, and Scorsese was clearly presenting that as an antidote to some of those great biblical epics of the 50s and 60s, or the greatest story ever told, with the divine Jesus who sort of reigns supreme. So these are the sort of questions that we very much address. So in that sense, how selective do we need to be? Are there certain types of films that we would exclude or include? What about so-called secular films in this context, which is pretty much a significant chunk of the stuff that we look at in the module? And also the elephant in the room. And I put that in double inverted commas. I should put that in quadruple inverted commas, because the number of times it's kind of funny when a student will say, even after they've done this module with me, when I talk about what is religion, what is film, and they'll say, I'm not religious, but. Now, I know what they mean. I know what they mean. It means they don't go to church or mosque or temple or synagogue, but they're involved and interested in all of these questions. But I think that's an important thing. So we try to cover all those bases. And I think the students find it sort of an inclusive atmosphere. I just have to address that issue about cancel culture, because I asked my students this very question, and I'll come in a minute to show one of the things I was looking at this week, which is on Islamic and Buddhist representations. And my students were really interested in this notion about what happens when, for example, you've got let's think, a film about Golda Meir, for example. So you're looking at a Jewish figure, when Helen Mirren, who's not a Jew, is playing that role. And how far do you go with that? Because it was another actress, Maureen Lipman, who was very critical, saying you should get a Jewish actress to play a Jewish role. Now, but you could end up, of course, with the wrong, you could have a liberal Jew playing an Orthodox Jew. So, and one of my students, and they came up with this amazing thing, I remember seeing this at university in the 90s, What's Eating Gilbert Grape? And I don't think it's Down syndrome. One of my students said it was, I think it's autism, isn't it? But the Leonardo DiCaprio character is playing a character with autism, but he's not himself autistic. And they said, if that was made today, would that be cancelled? Is it okay to play a trans role if you're not trans? And I think these questions are really at the cutting edge, because where do you end with all of this? Do you it's not a simple case of saying, on that basis you could be offended when, what was that Christopher Nolan film, not Inception, the one that came out during lockdown, Tenet. when you've got Kenneth Branagh playing the Russian, on that basis? Kate Blanchett almost won an Oscar for playing, who's an Australian actress playing an American. And also, what about serial killer? Do you have to be a serial killer to, Hannibal Lecter? Because these are the sort of ultimate questions about, Robert De Niro is brilliant at playing gangsters, but, because he's so good at playing those roles, you don't sort of question, and he can be a bit of a sort of opaque sort of person in himself. But we have to be careful about how we slot people into these kind of roles. So one of the things we do, and this is just an example of the, and this is relevant to the topic I'm talking about, wonderful quote from Clive Marsh in a book that he wrote, Theology Goes to the Movies, which I remember buying at a bookshop in Oxford, probably the day that I first met you, Milja, because it was at that conference in Oxford in 2007. And this is one of the most wonderful questions. And I always use this with my students. I turn everything back onto the students. Where he's claiming, and this was 15, 16 years ago, that who the students of theology, religious studies are. They're those who sit in lecture rooms and seminar rooms across the world. They may not have begun to examine the sort of things that theologians are supposed to do. What are the differences between salvation, liberation, and atonement? But they are interested in attacking them, and this is the crucial bit. They have seen The Shawshank Redemption. In other words, it's film that's bringing them into this dialogue. They're not thinking, I'm a theologian or a person of faith, and therefore I want to address these questions, and film is kind of a byproduct of that. The film is the way into the conversation. And that's kind of a fact, although that's not to say that all students have a sort of homogenous way in, that they all do the same thing in the same way. So all of these sort of questions here, this is just examples of the sort of topics that I cover in a lecture. And it's always around the conversation that transpires, which perhaps addresses the issue around gaps that we were just talking about a moment ago. In a sense, it's the conversation, it's that liminal space. It's not coming away saying, this is the film's meaning, this is the film's objective meaning. I remember being at school, people would often say, if we'd watched a Bond film on TV or something, or a Christopher Nolan film like Inception, or 12 Monkeys, Terry Gilliam, people would say, I know what it means, I've got the answer. And I'm like, am I thick or something? What's people sort of saying, that, I know it, like in a Gnostic sort of sense, that they've somehow apprehended the true meaning of the film. It's the conversation. If I'm writing a film review, I engage with 10 other film critics. So it's not me just watching the film, it's engaging in the reception that it's brought about. So that conversation is absolutely crucial to the module. And John Lydon, I think, is absolutely right in this, in the sense that we're all, whether you're a theologian or not, we're all implicated in popular culture. And his argument is that if you can make the case for saying that film is a religion, then every time you go to the movies, whether you're theistically inclined or not, you're going to be participating, whether you've got the vocabulary for it or whether you do it consciously or not. So these are the sort of things, and it may be that religious people can be no different in terms of their consumption of the arts than the non-religious or the a-religious or the anti-religious or whatever the sort of thing. And I've spent a lot of time on another module called Death in the Afterlife, by drawing on all these questions about universalism and Satan and whether the devil can be saved, and can you be romantic about hell. So actually the conversation about the devil taking charge is very interesting, but kind of in some ways regressive. I brought that in, I don't, on the basis of what Terry was talking about yesterday. So looking at Herbert Jumper, we also look at Percy Stickney Grant. If Christ went to the movies way back in 1920, you know far more than I do about this. I'll gloss over these slides. And
the end of that line was,
please.
The end of the line, if Christ went to the movies, he would be happy.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's wonderful because exactly. So it's an argument that Robert Jewett has sort of done as well about St. Paul. If Paul was here today, he'd be trying to preach the message in the secular sphere. So all these sort of things. And Andrey Tarkovsky, and I genuinely used this slide. So it was this wasn't me just, although I deliberately put it in here today. And that's why I use it for that wonderful quotation there about what cinema can do in terms of challenging and exploring the most complex problems of our time, just as literature, music and painting has done. That notion about searching. And that's kind of what I'm doing with my students. Obviously, Tarkovsky is on a completely different plane. But that's the sort of, it's that conversation that's important. But also one of the questions I'll discuss with my students, do some movies invite this sort of dialogue much more than others? And I love the work of Rob Johnston. I'm sure some of you know Rob very well. And I like the way he then says, but some films like The Shawshank Redemption lend themselves, or The Godfather, lend themselves to the sort of analysis. And there are some that don't. And yet, so we, so I mean, my students look at me in a sort of, you admit to watching Basic Instinct or Basic Instinct 2. Everything interesting begins in the mind. Well, there we are. But this film got terrible reviews. But that's the way in. Because Willem Dafoe played Jesus in The Last Temptation of Christ, but he's also known for playing the villain in Speed 2, the villain in Spider-Man, and also, of course, there was that film he did with Madonna. Do you remember the one which you may or may not admit to ever having watched? Body of Evidence. You know, so for me, if you're watching Willem Dafoe playing Jesus in a film, you're aware of all those other things going on. He's the villain from Speed too, that kind of thing. So actually, I think that it's wrong to sort of imagine that there are some films that are not worthy of exploration, because you'll find, and also, Basic Instinct is a perfect sort of epitome of fallenness, sin, transgression. You know, there are so many sort of ways into that. So in other words, we don't bracket out. We don't sort of say you can't look at this film because it's too secular or whatever what the criteria might be. So that sort of notion as well, and Gay Ortiz did a lot of work, as has S. Brent Place, on the common search for transcendence between communities, what subtitles can do, where cinema can actually bring about some form of ecumenical practice as well. And I think this is the last slide before I show you what I actually do in my seminars. And sort of the way that we're invited into other worlds, and you've got the sort of the world's forming that goes on in different religions, and all the different myths and rituals and practices, and how that actually links with what goes on in film as well, with the editing, the special effects. It makes it all seem sort of realistic and very bespoke. So the technology of film, a new world is assembled and projected onto the cinema screen. So we're dealing with creation myths. We're doing something here very important. So what I will do in my seminar, how long have I got? Yeah, I have a little time. What I will do with the students, I always begin with those sort of very generic questions. Sometimes, as happened even this week, the seminar takes place just after the lecture. So I will always say, what did you think of the lecture? What did you learn from it? What were the main ideas? Do you agree or disagree with the positions? That's kind of a way just to get the students talking amongst themselves, and I think that's an important part of the thing. So I'm going to give you an example here. I'm not going to attempt to answer all of these questions, but I'll give you an example of the questions. These are the questions that have been regurgitated from what students have said in previous years, and then I'll show you what some of my students from just the last few weeks have been saying. So this is an example of what I would do in a class at the very beginning when we say why religion in film. So it sort of fits in with some of those slides I just showed you a moment ago. So we will ask questions, and we've got 2 hours and we sort of go through these. We also look at a seminar text for the week as well, so plenty to pack in. So there's less room for me just to have to do all the talking, those gaps that need to be filled. So about, for example, what might secular films have to do with religion? What about using comic book superheroes? The students know more about comic books in some cases than they might do about film. And just looking at Batman Crucified, the Bruce David Forbes piece from the late 90s. Are we clutching at straws, looking for religion where it doesn't exist? Is it about getting religion talked about through the back door? In other words, what are our motivations for teaching this? Is it to sort of really teach, proselytize? That's not what I'm doing, but my agenda, there probably is an agenda, I suppose, in terms of what I'm doing, in terms of how I'm trying to get this conversation going. If somebody else was delivering the module, it would be done very differently. I'm very conscious and very guilty that so much of the material that I've dealt with is very Christian-centric, which is why I brought in Buddhist and Islamic perspectives, just because I was aware that that's where the literature was. That's always been my sort of comfort zone, but aware that, and I'll show you what the students think about all this in a moment. So are there theological frameworks or good versus evil that films are tapping into? Which films? I think this turn to the self is really important. We do it in anthropology, sociology, that sort of sense of, what about the audience? It's great to know what the director thinks, it's great to know what Spielberg thinks, etc. But if people are saying that E.T. is a Christ figure, Spielberg, who of course is Jewish, may not have intended that, and may be quite surprised, as is Tim Burton when he's often asked, what do you think about Edward Scissorhands being like a Christ figure? And these are not maybe intentional, but if people are interpreting them in that sort of way, how much stock do we take there? So how much attention do we accord to the role of the critic, the film critic, the filmmaker, the audience? Do they have equal weight? The students often will watch The Greatest Story Ever Told or bits of it, and they're not impressed. It's this huge canvas. George Stevens genuinely thought that he was doing something, because it came around at the tail end of death. Well, not the tail end, it was sort of at the very time that Death of God was back on the scene in the mid-1960s, and something fell out of sync. It was kind of like the film that 10 years earlier would have been amazing, and here it was just a bit too starchy. It wasn't a huge critical or commercial success. Why is that? So all of these sort of questions that we discuss in the course, I've got more and more questions here. Is film, is it all throwaway entertainment? Is there a sort of sense of film being serious, or religion being serious, but film being too light-hearted? Or maybe the other way around, of course. Some people might say that religion can be very sort of comical or very uplifting, and film can be very kind of dour and serious, depending on your genre. So these are the sort of questions. I won't go through all of these. These are just some of the answers just from this week. These are just me sort of writing down some of the things. There's more that was said than here. For example, students were interested in the juxtaposition or the pairing between the two. Interested in whether non-religious films can have a religious dimension, discussing as well what the classifications are here, how can we relate films to a religious topic. Interesting that Mary Poppins came up in that context as a healing figure. They love all the Disney stuff. The students love musicals, so they don't watch Jesus films, but they have seen the stage version of Jesus Christ Superstar. So I've learnt the lesson there that musicals really do resonate. But Mary Poppins has come up as an example, and the students came up with these points about creation myths and so on. Other people's perspectives were framed there, and our own way of understanding a film. Plenty to say about The Exorcist. I've known people who said it is a horror film, it's not a religious film, as if somehow a film is one but not the other. Some people who don't want to talk about the religion in that because they just like going for fun, for horror, and religion somehow is something that becomes part of the conversation and muddies the conversation. Mark Kermode would disagree. He thinks it's not just the best horror film, but the best film ever. Can we overanalyze films? And these are the sort of things that we come up with. And they continued here. Some films can have too much religion in them, which means you can't get too much out of them. So it's sort of, and it's true that some horror films can have a very simple pray for the devil, a very simple and unsophisticated theology, often dealing with binaries. That's great, but perhaps the talk earlier suggested that people do believe in binaries. The devil has taken over 99%. But certainly talking to my students, they wouldn't go down that sort of path. They wouldn't be inclined to think that a film can sort of just be read in that sort of black and white sort of way. We're looking at how every film, this is just some of the other responses from the students, every film has something religious in it, depending on how you define it. That's a very, I think, mature way of looking at it, because they're aware that it's down to an interpretation which you bring to the enterprise. It's in the eye of the beholder, so that's another thing that students have raised. It's what we bring to the interpretive task, what our agendas are, what it says about us, what it says about the person doing the analysis, perhaps more than about the film itself. How far outside of our comfort zone might we be prepared to go to find a religious interpretation? I always think of what happened with Tarantino's Kill Bill Volume 2, which came out at the same time as Gibson's Passion of the Christ, and some of the critics who deplored the one applauded the other. And I think that's really interesting, because Tarantino's film is theologically very rich, but he's not coming at that from that sort of angle. But maybe I'm watching the two together and thinking, maybe I enjoyed the themes in that film more than I did with the bludgeoning, the heavy-handed sort of approach that Gibson brought to the enterprise. So that's interesting. I'm the theologian who will be more interested in a Tarantino, perhaps, than a film that's clearly in that religious epic mode. Maybe because I feel the conversation was a bit too closed and close-minded. Yeah, what is a secular film? You can imagine we don't have many gaps in the conversation. And the students were talking about endings of a film. If an ending changes, if there's a director's cut, that kind of thing. So that's just an example. Oh, it even went on and on and on. This is just from the first week. Whether a same film can generate a very different response depending on the time when it's being watched, who you're with. I think I told them the example of Jojo Rabbit, which I saw at the cinema in Dover in Kent in a multiplex with lots of other people. It was mostly sort of teenage boys, I seem to recall, who were laughing at all the anti-Semitic stuff. And I was like, I really, really don't like this. I resented the film. Then a week or so later, it got all those Oscar nominations, and I thought, oh, interesting. I didn't take to it at all. A few friends said, it's a lot better than that. It's a more sort of subtle film. So I saw it in a more art house cinema with older sort of people there, and I was very moved by it. So again, the context of me watching it completely changed my review. I'm not sure I wrote two separate reviews of it, but I certainly felt that my understanding differed depending on the context. And so various examples here about, in some cases, films can affect their whole bodily composure. They gave the example of the horror film Midsummer from I think 2019. And so the way that films can affect our practices, our social schedules, and what happens when a filmmaker doesn't necessarily endorse what an audience does in their name, and when a film takes on a life of its own. Now, I'll go through some of these other things quite quickly, because I'm just bombarding you with stuff which I don't want to do, but these are the sort of questions. So I'll go through these here. These are some of the methodological questions that I pose to the students based on what has come up in previous years. You can see these is there more to film than literature. Because a lot of the literature on film is very literary based rather than looking at film as film. It's all about the plot. What about the role of music, for example? How interdisciplinary is all of this? So again, won't go into details, but what the students were really good at doing is they told me what religion means to them. What are the buzzwords? And they came up with God, redemption, compassion, faith, prayer, community. And then I said, what is film? And they came out with storytelling, journey, entertainment, experience, soundtrack, franchise. And then I spent some time with them going through and saying, are any of these interchangeable? You know, can some of the words in this line be substituted here? Journey could, storytelling could, maybe entertainment. Experience, absolutely. Soundtrack, well, Handel's Messiah, I guess, that could appear in the first category. Franchise, well, I guess we have mega churches, so it could work in that context as well. Hymns in a liturgical context and a filmic context can play the same role. So they found that they were getting a new sort of outlook on religion. So we had a session on cinema going and religion based on Clive Marsh's work, about whether the analogy is very contrived, that sort of thing. So these are the sort of questions that I put to them. Can a non-theist get deeper meaning from a film than a theist? Are church-going and cinema-going both immersive? What about, is it the same as escapist experiences? Can religion be separated from its institutional dimensions, and so on? So these are the sort of questions that we will go through in the course of the afternoon that we're teaching. And then these are just some of the answers that they gave. Fascinating stuff about whether the word secularization is applicable, whether it's the right term. Is there more that is it more the case that religion is taking place in other arenas? Maybe it's wrong to talk about the secularization of society today. Decline in church going, the students were spot on this. They said that maybe church going is declining, but cinema going is also declining. So rather than, hey, people are not going to church, but they're going to the cinema. So again, it's so obvious when they said that, but it was like, actually, yeah, I hadn't sort of seen it from the other end as well. They made a really good point about how shamanism has increased. This is from the British 2021 census in its adherence. So that has a role to play in all the conversations about cinema going. I'll go through these. I have a whole week on escapism, but you can see the questions there without me going through all of those. Oh yeah, does anyone imagine themselves as a Disney princess for the rest of their lives after watching a film and then feel disappointed when the real R-E-E-L and the real R-E-A-O-L don't match up? They love the Disney conversations, as do my young daughters. So we sort of look at these sort of questions, and then they will talk to me about whether escapism in some cases is not really all that bad, and how religion can also perform the role of comfort the film can do, particularly at times of bereavement, for example. So what is escapism a problem? Like Bultmann had a problem with myth in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. Is escapism a problem, or should we just sort of go with it kind of thing? And cartoons came up, and animation came up in that context as well. I think students would probably be more interested in cartoons than I am, actually. You should be teaching the course. I should invite you to deliver to my students, because I think they connect with a lot of what you're talking about. And I talk about implicit religion and so on. This is the last example I'm going to give. This is actually from my class this very week. So I was talking about Islam and Buddhism and some of the different questions and stereotypes in vogue, and the various caricatures that appear in films. Can non-Muslims or non-Buddhists do an equitable job of portraying Muslims or Buddhists on film? And another set of questions there. Is there scope for more diverse portrayals on screen? And the students were just going through some of these. I've only got a couple of slides after this. This notion of an alien other. We always have an enemy. We always have another. And if it isn't a Muslim who's playing that role in a typical Hollywood kind of disaster movie or thriller, then somebody else will take on that role. So there's a lot of really good penetrative stuff. We were looking at Sharon Shu's work on Buddhism. and problems with like the Karate Kid, and on the grounds that it has nothing to say about lay Buddhism. It's always the old wise man. It's a wonderful kind of caricature, but it's like that's not representative of Buddhism. There's more to Buddhism than what you see in there. But also, people are not going to go to a film for that more compassionate, multi-layered thing. It's all important for the scholar to have that conversation, but people want to go to the cinema for those stereotypes, and that's why I find the students have some really clever, insightful things to say. How film can raise these questions. So we'll have a whole week on Christ figures. Great, but it's kind of a straw man argument, or maybe it's creating a problem that's not there and talking about it for 2 hours. What about the real world stuff on disability, on sexuality, on race, on being on the margin, marginalisation, disability? What are those sort of questions that need to be here? Rather than focusing on some of the stuff that the scholars have written lots about, but it's not really relating to the students. But they did say that they feel that they're learning perhaps as much about religion as they are about film, so the conversation there I think is important. Tackling issues that we wouldn't necessarily see as being related to religion, which I thought was an interesting point, and I'm no doubt we discussed that in some detail on Tuesday. But also the need, so they were teaching me, as they often do, about the need in that sense for the importance of accessible and approachable topics. So I found that the students do a phenomenal thing, which is when you're involved in any sort of teaching exercise, that you're being taught by the students, which is why I come back. So the students are teaching me. I'm learning as much from the students as well, and the way that they interact with the material that I'm presenting. And sometimes they're more interested than in other topics. So I feed all of that, I take all of that on board and draw on it in my own work, because otherwise, what is the point? Am I just going to turn up every week and say, this is the answer to the question and just talk for 2 hours? So it's the dialogue with the students that I think is the most important component of what I do.